Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our April 18th Brotherhood Breakfast. I'm Larry Gutterman, President of Brotherhood. We're thrilled today to have Josh Campbell speaking with us, joining us this morning. I'll introduce him in a moment. A few programming notes. Our next breakfast is May 2nd, when the Georgetown Law School Innocence Project, Martin Tankeleff and Mark Howard will discuss their latest project, film called Making an Exoneree, with several of their law students.
Good.
And then on June 6th, we've added an event to have the Museum of Jewish History of Paris give us a virtual tour. We're doing this in conjunction with the French Consulate of New York. Thanks to our member, Temple member, Michelle Perez, who put that, who helped introduce us and get it together. April 29th, right around the corner, we're co-hosting with the Social Justice Committee, a talk with Bob Costas about the 1968 Olympic Games. Plenty going on. Great to see that we're doing services outside again. Hope we'll see each other around the temple shortly. So to today's program, Josh Campbell, who's joining us, thanks to our Brotherhood board member, Andrew Lachow, is CNN correspondent, covers national security and law enforcement issues. He reports domestically and internationally and provides on-air analysis across CNN's platforms. Can often be found at the scene of critical security events, helping to lead breaking news coverage on issues involving public safety. Today's joining us from Minneapolis, where he's covering events there. Prior to joining CNN, Josh was a supervisory special agent with the FBI, spending over a decade conducting terrorism, hostage recovery, cyber and counterintelligence investigations. Josh is an adjunct senior fellow and policy researcher with the Center for New American Security and a term member on the Council of Foreign Relations. He's a Navy veteran and has taught digital national security at the University of Southern California. Holds a Master of Arts in Communication from Johns Hopkins University and a BA in Government from the University of Texas at Austin. So Josh will talk about his latest book, Crossfire Hurricane, about the Russia investigation involving the 2016 presidential campaign, as well as more current security events. We were talking just before the meeting. Josh is looking forward to taking and discussing any questions or concerns that you have. And as we've said before, use the chat feature of Zoom to send your questions. And as when he's done with his prepared part of his discussion, we'll turn to those. So we encourage as many questions as possible. Thanks, as always, to my fellow Temple board members, to Andrew Lachow for introducing us to Josh, to Marty Kannengeiser for helping to organize this, to Jane and the office staff for the work that they do. Another reminder that we've waived non-member registration for the remaining Brotherhood events this year. So we encourage
the meeting on yours. It's now on mine.
Okay. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Josh. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. And thanks to Andy for connecting me with you all. And thanks for tuning in this morning. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you all. If I can say just at the outset, selfishly, it is really great to see you all because I work in a medium where I never get to see anyone. I'm staring into a camera, into a piece of and so I never get to interact, or rarely get to interact. So I really appreciate the opportunity to join you all. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the book at the outset and go over that, and then talk a little bit about how some of what we've experienced over the last couple years applies to today and the multitude of challenges that the country is facing. And then I very much look forward to your questions. That's actually my favorite part. As I went on the book tour for Crossfire Hurricane that was always the most enriching part for me, was actually getting to interact with readers and to hear your questions and to have conversations. So I'm not going to speak that long because I really want to get to the questions, and I really enjoy that part. Just to set the stage, I'll talk a little bit about the book. I'll say that whenever I wrote this book, I had no idea at the time that the lessons, the thesis of the
Not bad
book,
quality audio.
some of the key takeaways would still apply to today. But I'll talk a little bit about those as well. So Crossfire Hurricane, Inside Donald Trump's War on Justice and the FBI is, it's a few things. It's my experience having been inside the FBI, going through a tumultuous time where you had a law enforcement agency that was conducting high-profile investigations involving both of the top candidates for the presidency and folks in their orbit, while also being on the receiving end of constant attacks from a president in a way that the FBI has simply never seen. And so, just to kind of set the stage, when I was inside the FBI, I'd gone through a number of different assignments, working counterterrorism, cyber counterintelligence cases. And as I went up through the organization during my career there, I had the opportunity to spend a great deal of time overseas working with our foreign partners. And it was that experience working overseas so much that really allowed someone like me to see what the brand of the FBI truly means and how it is important for the FBI to be seen as an institution that's trustworthy, that the general public and people around the world see the FBI as an organization that is honorable. And the reason for that is for a number of reasons. But first, the FBI, everything that this organization does is based on public trust. When an FBI agent knocks on someone's door during the course of an investigation. So me as an FBI agent previously, when I would conduct a case, I would knock on someone's door asking for help. Maybe they were a witness to something. Maybe they saw something. They knew some piece of information that would help my investigation. The willingness of that person on the other side of that door to assist me and the FBI was directly correlated with their view of the FBI. Is this an agency that is trustworthy? Is this an agency that is honorable? Or is this an agency full of deep state criminals, as has been alleged many times over the presidency of Donald Trump? And so it's not just the brand the FBI wants to feel like it's respected. There are real public safety consequences if the public actually starts to doubt the credibility of this institution. And so at the time when I was in the FBI, I had gone through different assignments as I promoted into leadership. One of my last assignments was actually having the honor to serve as a senior career agent in the office of the FBI director. I was a special assistant to former director James Comey. And what I experienced, and what so many of my colleagues experienced, was after the firing of James Comey, so many of us were looking around in the agency, pretty much shell-shocked about what had happened. The president had fired the FBI director because the FBI director would not drop an investigation into an associate of the president, Michael Flynn. And so it was obviously a tumultuous time for the agency. But one thing that was the topic of conversation was that no one was defending this agency. So Donald Trump had continually, blasted the FBI as a bunch of crooks, as the deep state. And my colleagues and I would look around and say, well, when is someone going to step up and say that this is nonsense? When is the current FBI director? When is the attorney general? Others in government when are they going to step up and say this needs to stop? And so I came to that realization at the time that somewhat ironically, that in order to defend this organization, I have to step outside of this organization, because as an FBI agent, you couldn't go to the cameras and hold a press conference and the like, as a career agent. And so that was my decision to, I understood that, look, no one is speaking, no one with any consequence or power is speaking about the truth of this organization, but also there are real consequences if this narrative takes hold that we are a bunch of criminals. And so I made that decision that, look, I'm going to step outside, and that was my road into journalism, to try to help the public understand what exactly this agency is, warts and all, because the FBI is not perfect. And so that led to this book. And what I try to do in Crossfire Hurricane, which was the code name for the FBI's Russia investigation into Trump world, is I try to take you inside the room so you know what it was like to be in this agency as you're dealing with not only these high profile cases, the Hillary Clinton email investigation, obviously the investigation into 4 associates of Donald Trump who had these questionable ties to the government of Russia, and then the aftermath of that up to the president firing the head of the FBI, and really bring you in the room and let you understand what it was like inside the agency to go through that. But then the aftermath, where you had Donald Trump, after the appointment of Robert Mueller, who I had also worked for previously when he was FBI director, to take you into the room and help you understand what it was like to be on the receiving end of these constant attacks. And what I talk about in the book is, the FBI obviously is not perfect. I go through through the history of the organization. There have been real abuses by the FBI and the intelligence community, the 60s, the 70s, previous to that. And then there were reforms that were put in place because of these real abuses. And so what Donald Trump attempted to do is, after the appointment of the special counsel, where you had Robert Mueller, you had his team, a very rigorous investigation into, Trump's alleged association with the government of Russia. What Donald Trump attempted to do was destroy the credibility of this institution, the Justice Department and the FBI, out of fear of what the results might be. So, for example, if he could convince a segment of society that Robert Mueller, that the FBI, that all these quote unquote deep staters are crooks, then that might diminish the credibility of whatever Robert Mueller eventually found and discovered and reported on in his final investigative report. And the problem with that is that no agency is beyond criticism in government, especially these very powerful agencies like in law enforcement and intelligence. And in politics, and those of you who maybe have worked in campaigns and around the electoral process, that is often fair game. That oftentimes for a candidate in public office, they benefit by trying to undermine the credibility of their opponent, to try to convince the public that, look, I'm the good person, this is the bad person, and that's politics. And at the end of the day, there are winners and losers, and rarely do people sit around wondering whatever happened to the loser. I mean, unless you were intimately part of that campaign. That's fair game in politics. That strategy that Donald Trump used, in politics, it was something that we often see. The problem is when you use those same tactics against a law enforcement agency, against a public safety entity, there are real consequences, as I just described. And so, as Trump tried to undermine the credibility of the FBI and the Justice Department by using these same tactics and techniques, calling them criminals, undermining them, the aftermath is that diminishment of public safety, as I just described, because now there is actually polling data to back this up, that a significant number of Trump supporters and Republicans question the credibility of the FBI. And what I do in the book is take you point by point through so many of the criticisms, and I lay out criticisms of my own, to James Comey, my former boss, who I respect, to certain decisions that were made with the Hillary Clinton case and the Russia investigation. But in the main, what I try to help you understand is the narrative that we've heard over and over throughout the Trump presidency, that this agency and its members are corrupt, is simply not the case. It's one of the most admirable institutions I've ever been a part of, and I really take you inside and help you understand what the men and women of the FBI are truly like. So that's the book. And again, obviously a controversial period. And it takes a book to have to walk through these. I mean, it's hard to do this in a TV segment to encapsulate everything that I talk about in the book. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's informative as you go through it. And then the last thing I'll say before we open up to questions is, as I mentioned before, I could not have imagined that what transpired over the last 4 years would still be applicable to so many of the challenges that we see today. But there's one key takeaway that I hope that you'll realize, and that is, throughout Donald Trump's presidency, and I say this as, I'm not a political person, as someone who's in journalism, it doesn't matter to me what party you're with, but I can look at certain actions and predict their potential negative consequences. And I think we saw that with that January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, where you had a president who continually said, I am the law and order president. I'm the president that respects law enforcement. Yet throughout his presidency, he worked to undermine law enforcement. These federal agents, career agents who were going about their day trying to do their job. You had people like Rudy Giuliani who were comparing career FBI agents to Nazis, calling these FBI agents who were out there doing this investigation, conducting lawful investigations, executing lawful search warrants against, for example, Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer and fixer. You had people like Giuliani saying that these are Nazi stormtroopers, making that comparison. And so you can't say that you are a law and order president or person and people in your orbit if you've spent your entire presidency trying to undermine law enforcement. And then that brings us obviously to the Capitol insurrection, where you have that same theme, the president that said, I am the president of law and order, who was then inspiring his own supporters, to include Giuliani, on that day as well, to go and conduct what we saw in the aftermath. And so I mention that because although the presidency of Donald Trump is over, at least the first term, we don't know if he'll attempt to run again, the consequences to this threat to law and order continue even beyond him. And we saw that in the Capitol insurrection. We see it even to this day, where you have people who, subscribed as Trump supporters who have been engaged in violence. And I'll give you, one other example. I'm sitting here right now in Minneapolis, where obviously there's the trial of a former police officer here who's charged in the murder of George Floyd. I was here last year during the summer, where we saw riots and there were attacks on buildings. And there, people may not realize this now because there's just so much news. It's just this torrent of news that comes at us. But when I was here in Minneapolis last May, standing in front of a police station that was being burned, what people assumed was, okay, these are the far left, Antifa or whomever that are going after this, and there certainly was they were there, they're engaged in this. But as we learned later, during the course of trying to whip up some of the fear, including one person who. Well, I'm going to pause because I'm on hotel Wi-Fi. I hope you can still hear me. I got a little note saying that maybe it was a little unstable, but I'll continue. So you had someone more closely aligned with Donald Trump who was there trying to help, whip up and instigate some of what we saw. And so I mentioned that to say that it's not as clear cut as people might think about what the lingering threat is from what Donald Trump has inspired, because we see, and I continue to talk about this even now, this emboldening of white supremacists, people who were once, shunned by society, pushed to the far corners of what society was willing to accept, are now feel emboldened. And obviously we see in so many incidents in this country that it's not academic. They are a real threat, and we see lives lost because of it. So that is the thesis of the book. That's what I've been focused on now, this issue that we have to take law and order seriously, that we have to be serious about speaking out against some of this violent ideology that continues to this day, and not be afraid to stand up in support of those law enforcement entities that are charged with trying to protect the nation. And that doesn't mean that it's full-throated support. Obviously, as a journalist, I write very critical stories of law enforcement sometimes, to include the FBI. But in the main, having to understand that these are good women and men who could be doing anything else. They could be making a ton of money, in the private sector, but they decide to go into public service and do that job for the sole mission of trying to protect the American public. And the more good people are willing to step up and defend these agencies and to call out some of these attacks, the greater public safety will be for all of us. And that's the thesis. With that, I would look forward to the questions. Larry, I'll leave it up to you how we're gonna, I don't know if you're gonna read them or people are just gonna ask, but I look forward to that part. So thanks for joining, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Josh. You only paused or hung for a moment on my screen. But anyway, I have a couple of questions here. Encourage people to send some more. So one question, start off. I grew up in 1950s in a very progressive household. The FBI was considered to be a terrorist organization, the McCarthy era. My mother has an FBI file which we were able to obtain from the Sunshine Act. How did the reforms of which you speak restore the FBI to an honorable status? What were some of those reforms?
Great question. So I want to talk to you about something that I write about in the book, which is if you go back to the moment after Donald Trump was elected president. So this is now January of 2017, before he's inaugurated. I was actually with James Comey. I went to Trump Tower with him, and this was the first meeting between Donald Trump and Comey, and then some of the other intelligence officials. And so I talk about that experience and kind of the aftermath of that. But the focus of that meeting, if you all will recall from the news, is that not only did the intelligence community want the incoming president to know about what Russia had done during the 2016 election, they also wanted the incoming president, to know that there was this the so-called Steele dossier that was kind of percolating out there, about to be published in the press. This was the document that a former British spy had compiled, basically, that said that the Russians had a bunch of dirt on Donald Trump, including some very salacious things. And so Comey had the unenviable task of briefing Trump on that. And of course, everything went downhill from there. Trump thought that he was trying to be blackmailed, and all of this. And so I mentioned that to say, which, if you're wondering, what does that have anything to do with the question that was just asked? If you go back to whenever Richard Nixon was first elected president, blocks away from where we were there at Trump Tower, then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover went to brief Richard Nixon, and he sat down with him in a hotel in New York City. And rather than saying, I want you to know about the threats that are out there, we want to brief you on what the FBI is doing to counter a bunch of threats, what Hoover did is try to win over the new president, which I write about in the book, by letting him in on some secrets, talking about some of the bad, illegal things that the FBI had done, to include, which this was fascinating to do this research, which I didn't even know about this, and I spent a career in the FBI, is this allegation that the FBI actually wiretapped Nixon's airplane at the behest of Lyndon Johnson. And so Nixon was letting him in on all of these secrets in order to try to win him over, because that was J. Edgar Hoover was trying to do that because that was his style, to try to, let me let you in on some secrets, because then I want you to support me down the road. And so I mentioned that to say that those are two different, obviously, styles of humanity, right? Someone who wants to brief a president because they want them to know what the FBI is doing to counter threats, and then an FBI director who wants to brief a president so that the president knows that, hey, there are all these tools that are potentially at your disposal should you decide to use them. And my point is that there was actual abuse and corruption inside the FBI at the time. And of course, in the aftermath of the Church Committee, where not only the FBI but CIA and other intelligence agencies were accused of actually violating civil liberties, of wiretapping Americans, of opening files, of the amount of wiretapping that was done, the invasion of privacy on the signature of the FBI director at the time is simply stunning. And it's important to note that, because after the 1970s, when this all came to light, there was real reform. You had the Congress setting up these, and this gets to your question, the intelligence oversight committees, which didn't exist before, where Congress said, no, we are no longer going to take the president's word, the executive branch's word about what these agencies are doing, but we are going to assert our own oversight over them. And so now, to this day, whenever the intelligence community prepares to engage in any type of significant covert action or other intelligence gathering activity, they will actually brief these committees, and they have to keep them fully informed about what they're doing, which in and of itself is an incredible reform. Because before, someone like Nixon or presidents prior could basically do whatever they want, and then the Congress wouldn't even know about it. So that was significant. There was also a reform that came about in the aftermath, which was really tested by Donald Trump. And that is the Congress decided that, look, J. Edgar Hoover has been on the job for almost 50 years, which is a little long for anyone, right, who is in this big position of power. They didn't want that to occur again. So they passed a law dictating that the FBI director would be subjected to a 10-year term. And the reason why they picked 10 years is because they wanted to remove the FBI out of politics. So any FBI director appointed by one president, because presidents only get to serve a maximum of 8 years, would then naturally move over into the presidency of his successors, or his or her successors. And so that was one of the reforms. That, look, we're not going to let anyone sit in this position, this very powerful position, for 50 years and amass all of this power and do, God knows who knows what. So they passed that law to ensure that the FBI director wouldn't serve longer than 10 years, which of course, the president can still fire and hire, whomever he wants, or at least fire them, people in government. But what we found out with James Comey, and I write at length about the firing. I was there with him on that day in Los Angeles when he received the news that he was fired, is that was the first testing of so many of these norms that we've seen up until the point an FBI director would only be fired for cause. For example, the only FBI director who was fired before Comey was William Sessions, who President Clinton fired because there was this allegation of corruption and basically fraud of using resources for the Justice Department for personal gain. And so, but up to that point, there had to be a reason. And so what we found with James Comey is that even though the FBI director gets a 10-year term, a president can still, if the president has corrupt intent, and in this case wanted to fire Comey because Comey wouldn't let the Russia investigation go away, then that was the result where he actually did that. And so there's actually talk right now about, well, do we try to either legislate or we, the Congress, the country, in order to ensure that an FBI director can only be fired for cause. So that's a whole debate that's going on. But to your point, I can totally understand why people in the 50s and the 60s and even before then would wonder, why is this agency different today than it was then? And I would submit to you that it was not only because of those reforms, but just finally, I know, having gone through the FBI, one thing that they teach you at the FBI Academy is that you conduct every one of your investigations as though tomorrow it could end up on the front page of the Washington Post. And they say that, and because that's the idea that, look, you have to ensure that what you do is done correctly, within policy, certainly within law, but also that you're doing investigations that are a good use of the taxpayers' dollars. So for all of those reasons, it is built in and kind of baked into the mind and ethos of an FBI agent now, an analyst, that you have to ensure that your work can pass the scrutiny of someone looking over your shoulder, whether that's Congress, whether that's the press. And I submit to you that does drive behavior in a good way. And I know even now, being on the journalism side of the house, because I still talk to FBI agents and analysts now, doing my work, is that so many of them actually welcome an adversarial press because they know that makes them better. If the FBI screws up, and there's a big scandal, or not just a scandal, but there's a big expose, or you have journalists that are banging down their door, wanting to make sure that they've done the right thing, that makes them better and ensures that they continue to operate within the bounds that they're supposed to. So a much different organization than the past. But to get back briefly to the book, that was the whole idea that Trump was trying to achieve, in my judgment, to make the American people believe that the FBI today was the same FBI during the Hoover era, which in my view, there's nowhere close. Thanks for the question.
Okay, well, thank you. So the next question, investigation by John Durham is still ongoing. Do you expect it will result in new revelations that will further damage the image of the FBI?
It certainly could. I mean, this is an investigation that for many of us has gone on for a long time. I mean, that's an opinion, a long time. But the thing is, I've talked to people that have been interviewed by him, and that may be within the span or scope of this investigation, and no one seems to be particularly worried that that they're going to go to jail, or that there's going to be any type of a criminal prosecution, against them. And so, to answer the question, I don't really know what it will reveal. Now, it is worth pointing out, and I do so in the book, that again, there were real abuses during the Russia investigation. We know that one FBI lawyer is being prosecuted or was prosecuted for, I wouldn't say even allegedly now, for changing an email document as it related to the FBI's surveillance over one of the Trump associates. And so that is real abuse that was found. And so the FBI can't say that it's pure, that they did every single thing right. But my point, and what so many, even people who are skeptical of the FBI, in journalism covering it, know that it's one thing to say, well, a mid-level lawyer, cut corners. That's a whole other, entirely different thing to say the entire leadership of the FBI was out to bring down Donald Trump. But Trump has tried to blur all the lines, together. So we're still obviously waiting to see what that investigation will mean, or what comes of it. I think one thing that we have seen with President Biden is that he is basically returning to that pre-Trump norm of distancing the White House from the Justice Department. We know that Trump was not only close with Bill Barr, obviously, but was constantly calling for the prosecution of his political enemies, where we see Biden back up and obviously go back to the way things were before. And that is, okay, the DOJ can do its work. The White House is not going to interfere. And it's been interesting to see that Durham has been allowed to continue his investigation without the Biden people, getting in the middle of that. So we'll have to wait and see what they come up with. It is just curious to me that it's gone on so long. So we'll see. We'll see what he comes up with.
Okay. So the next one's a fairly pointed question. Would you say that Donald Trump is a Russian agent?
It's a good question, and I've gotten that one before. And my response to that is, and I think we can all, I think this will make sense regardless of what your political view may be, whether you're on the right or on the left, Republican, Democrat. What I try to do is look at Donald Trump's actions. And to answer the question pointedly at the outset, I don't know specifically or explicitly whether he's a Russian asset, but I do know there's something wrong going on there. And the reason I say that is because Donald Trump had probably the largest ego of any president that the United States has seen. And that's not a criticism, because he would tell you that. I mean, he constantly talked about how great he is at every turn. He's a very stable genius. He's the smartest, the best words, hires the best people. I mean, that's not a criticism to say that he has a gigantic ego. And the reason why I talk about his ego is because it doesn't make sense how someone with that large of an ego would collapse when confronted by Vladimir Putin and totally capitulate. I mean, you look at how Donald Trump interacted with Vladimir Putin throughout his presidency, to include that stunning press conference in Helsinki where Donald Trump sided with the Russians over the US intelligence community. It does not make sense why someone with that ego would kowtow to another global leader, and not just once, but at every single turn. And so there's a reason for that. We don't know specifically what it is. I mean, personally, I think it would be highly unlikely, just kind of, us knowing kind of Trump, who he is, that he's a Russian asset or on the books as a spy. But I think it's probably more along the lines of financial entanglement. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting on that, about Trump's dealings with with the Russians as it relates to money. There was this idea that perhaps when Trump was bankrupt, one of a number of times, that maybe the Russians were bailing him out when no bank would try to do so. And so I think it's probably more along those lines, not, a witting asset of the Russian government, but if he's embarrassed by certain things, certain connectivity to the Russian government, and he doesn't want that to come to light, then perhaps that would explain his continually siding with the Russians. But regardless of what the reason is, which I firmly believe we will learn, it's just the way things work. I mean, even just this past week, I don't know if you saw this news, but despite the fact that Trump had spent his entire presidency saying no collusion with the Russians and blasting anyone who would suggest it, it was just released by the federal government that polling data that was provided by the Trump campaign to this Russian asset was then provided to Russian intelligence. And people wonder, well, what is internal polling data? How does that help the Russians? Because if you remember at the time in the 2016 election, whenever the Russians were engaged in this full-on assault on the election and trying to undermine Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, that was beneficial to know what the internal polling data was from the Trump campaign so that the Russians could then try to recalibrate and figure out how to target key voters and try to change their mind. So I say that to say that came out last week. So who knows what's going to come out in the future. But that's where I come down on the whole, is he a Russian asset thing? I think it's less likely he's a winning asset. I mean, that's just doesn't seem how either of those entities operate, Trump world or the Russians. But there's something there. I mean, there is something there, because to me, nothing else explains, again, as I mentioned, someone with that ego acting completely different around Putin as opposed to anyone else he's ever encountered.
Okay, thanks. Move on. Again, about the back to the campaign. Did Comey violate FBI policy by saying there would be no charges against Hillary, but she had been extremely careless 11 days before election, disclosing there were new emails that had been discovered which could be relevant?
Yeah, so two things there. So, and I talk about this, I actually take you in what it was like leading up to that press conference where he, blasted Hillary Clinton. But two things there that we're talking about. So we're talking about the July press conference where Comey goes to the microphone, announces that the FBI will not be recommending charges against Hillary Clinton, but then, completely blasted her. So there's that part. And then later on, just before the election, Comey sent a letter to Congress announcing that the FBI had reopened the FBI's investigation into Clinton after it came to light during this Anthony Weiner investigation that there might be additional emails that the FBI hadn't located. And so two things there. So did Comey violate FBI policy in holding that press conference in July? I think the answer is no, not a policy per se. But if you ask the Justice Department, it was complete insubordination. Because what typically happens is obviously the FBI director reports to the Attorney General. And so the Attorney General would want to know what was going on in the course of an FBI investigation. But what Comey decided was, I'm going to step outside the Justice Department and announce this on my own. And the reason, as he said, that he did that is because prior to that announcement, if you'll recall, then Attorney General Loretta Lynch was in Arizona and on the tarmac of the airport, met privately with Bill Clinton. And even after that, both Clinton and Lynch said that they didn't discuss the investigation. There was nothing untoward. But as Comey has described, Lynch still refused to recuse herself from that investigation. And so what Comey worried was, look, if I announce that the FBI is not going to charge Hillary, or not going to recommend charging Hillary Clinton, there might be a segment of society that says, well, the FBI, you're in the tank for Hillary because, the AG was meeting with the Clintons and all of this. So that was Comey's thinking, that I'm going to step outside and make this announcement on my own. And people can, agree or disagree whether or not that was insubordination. The second part is trickier, and this is one of the ways in which I criticize Comey in the book, is the language that was used to describe Hillary Clinton's behavior, where he said, she was sloppy and, went through basically all the things, basically saying, and it's interesting, I talked to one of the Hillary Clinton's campaign people, interviewed him for the book. And he said that, basically what Comey did was say, she's a terrible person, but we're not going to charge her, which is usually not what the FBI does. If you're going to charge someone, you work with prosecutors to charge them. If you close the case, you don't come out and say, here's all these terrible things this person did, but by the way, we're not going to do it. So fair criticism there for how that went down. The second part, which again, I talk about in the book, and I still remember to this day being with Comey whenever he sent the letter to Congress reopening the investigation, was if the question is, was that a policy violation? It is very close to a policy violation, if not a policy violation, because the Department of Justice has had this norm that you don't take investigative steps on any case in the run-up to an election. And and that's been FBI policy for years and years, or DOJ policy for years and years, because neither entity, Justice or the FBI, wants to be seen as potentially meddling with the result of an investigation. So, for example, as a hypothetical, if the FBI knew that a particular member of Congress was taking bribes in September, October before an election, the FBI, because of this policy, almost certainly wouldn't go, knock down doors to execute search warrants, or, certainly go arrest people, because of that policy, that even though it might be lawful and allowed, there's still this bright line that you don't want to be seen as interfering with the election. And so that was the criticism that Comey received here was, it's not a policy per se on the books, it's this norm, the way the entity has operated for years and years. And so that was the main criticism for him there. If you're going to announce that this investigation is reopened just days before an election, that is a clear violation of this norm. But what Comey decided, and you can agree with him or disagree with him, there are certainly different views on this. What he decided is that if we reopen this investigation without telling Congress or telling the public, and it turns out later on after the election that there's some criminal, piece of criminal information that the FBI found against Hillary Clinton, we are going to be seen as hiding that from the public. And so what he said is that he was faced with a terrible option and a really terrible option, and he chose the terrible option. That is, obviously acknowledging to Congress that the investigation had been reopened. And that's something that he will, I think, and I've told him this before, that's going to be the first line of your obituary, is you potentially threw a presidential election by your actions. And, what he has said is that, look, I know, but, put yourself in my shoes faced with these terrible decisions. But obviously good people can continue to disagree about those actions, and people still disagree, obviously.
Oh, yeah, very, very interesting. All right, let's see here. We learned from Comey's book that though the FBI is apolitical, the makeup of the agency reflects the right and left leanings of the nation. How is the reaction inside the FBI with all the bashing from Trump?
What is so interesting is that, interesting for me, is that some of the most full-throated criticism against Trump's actions were coming from people that I knew to be very conservative inside the FBI. And that was interesting because it's not just, obviously, there's this thing people say, well, the FBI, you check your politics at the door, right, when you do your job. That's right in a way. You certainly don't let it influence your work. That is known that you're not going to take some investigative action based on your personal beliefs, but you do know what your colleagues believe because you're not robots, right? We're people. You have conversations. You have water cooler conversations, and so it's this close. You build that camaraderie, and you know people. And so I mentioned that to say, it was interesting for me knowing that some of the people that I know that were, very conservative were the most critical of what Trump was doing. And that was telling because it made me realize that it's not a left-right thing. It's not a political thing. It's not just Democrats conveniently saying, Trump's being mean to us, but even people who might subscribe to his political beliefs, his ideology, and maybe even voted for him, saying this is nonsense and this has to stop. And, the problem is that I can say that, and I do say that. You're not going to hear that from inside the FBI because because it's not this deep state as Trump said. You're not hearing people, coming out and saying, well, Trump's a crook, he's a criminal. You're left to people like journalists like me and others talking to people inside the organization to get that read on what's transpiring. But I mentioned that to say again that it's not that this gets back to this whole kind of house of cards, Trump's law and order demeanor. Is that you can't on one hand say I'm for law and order and then spend all your time trying to undermine them. And the point is that people left and right certainly felt that inside.
Okay, so continuing along the line, how does the FBI conduct investigations which involve several jurisdictions, including allies? At what point does the FBI share secrets with other friendly agencies?
So there are layers to this. So I can tell you as having worked overseas for much of my FBI career. So you have, when it comes to intelligence sharing, there's this arrangement called the Five Eyes. And these are 5 nations that are very close allies that share information on a regular basis. And it's the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, the so-called Five Eyes. And there's a specific classification marking for intelligence inside the FBI and other entities. You will mark something releasable to the Five Eyes. And it's just basically opening the aperture. And when you're conducting a case, it's actually the norm now that you try to share as much as you can with those entities, with your Five Eye partners. Now, of course, that goes beyond that too, where there are different intelligence sharing arrangements between different countries as well. I would say it's less. I would certainly say it's less robust than that partnership of those five nations. But for example, if the FBI, if I'm working in Indonesia on a terrorism investigation, I'm sharing intelligence with the local host nation. I give them names of sources and techniques and things like that, but there is this robust sharing. And I'll say even with the Russians, which America obviously sees as an adversary, they still share information to some degree, obviously not in a way that they do with other countries, but it is important. And I think that's what people may not understand about how the intelligence community works, how the FBI works as well. First, I think most people would be surprised that the FBI has such a large presence overseas in over 75 countries. You have FBI agents assigned to work with host nation intelligence and law enforcement partners. But then also, our CIA partners are abroad in even more countries than that. And so people think that you're just there you're in it for you're collecting information, you're conducting your investigations, but so much of it is working with the host nation to share information. And if there are threats in the US that can help overseas, a foreign country mitigate, you're sharing that information, and vice versa. We continually receive information from foreign partners about potential threats in the United States. So it's very much a two-way street, and obviously different layers there depending on the specific relationship with the individual country.
Okay, great. I'm going to turn it to Trump now. I got 3 questions. I'm going to hit you with all of them at once because they're all related.
Okay.
The first question, broadly based, please comment on the issue of whether a sitting president can be indicted. The question right below that someone else asked, unknowing of the other. After multiple abuses, why hasn't Trump been prosecuted? And then lastly, how confident are you that the investigation by Cyrus Vance will result in criminal prosecution of Trump?
So first question, can a sitting president be indicted? This is not punting, but it really doesn't matter what I think, because the way it works is that there's a office.
We lost you.
The policy and what the OLC has decided, this has been a long held opinion, that a sitting president, and I'm losing internet in and out. Let me know if you can still hear me. Thumbs up, good. Okay, good. They've decided that a sitting president can't be indicted. Which was obviously the big point of concern during the Mueller investigation, and as part of our reporting and all the work that we've done. That was the decision that the Mueller people were trying to make. Even if we find criminality, what can we do with it? As it relates to a sitting president. And Mueller got great criticism, for example, for not pressing to subpoena Trump to testify. We know the way it resulted was, them, the Mueller team sending over some questions and Trump's lawyers basically sending back the answers rather than commanding an interview with the president. And Mueller got great criticism for that. But in talking with people inside, the legal worlds, what I've learned, or what me and my colleagues have learned, is that Mueller basically realized that, look, even if I do this, they're going to litigate this. This is going to take years and years to figure out if we can interview Trump. But also, even if we do find out that he's committed a crime, can we do anything with that? And that's why so many people believe that the Mueller report, the audience was Congress to take up impeachment or to take, to go that route rather than the justice system. And so that is still the policy of the Justice Department, that a sitting president can be indicted. Obviously, that's open to interpretation. But I'll say one thing: what Mueller did, and this was somewhat glossed over in his report, I think, is that he preserved all of this information, all of the witness interviews, all of the evidence, all of the grand jury testimony and the things that went before the grand jury were what they call preserved. So that could be used down the road. So even if Mueller thought, well, I can't do anything with this as it relates to Trump, down the road, could we possibly do something? And there's a question, well, if a president is not in office, can he be indicted? And so I think that is still, possibly being debated right now. I think the risk for the Biden world and a Biden Justice Department, well, if you target Trump or target him for prosecution, is that worth it? Is it worth spending the Biden presidency focused on Donald Trump, or do we just move on as it relates to the federal government? Which gets to the last question about what the DA in New York is going to do. I think it's more likely than not that there will be legal consequences for Trump world, whether that's Donald Trump, whether that's his sons, his son-in-law. And I think it's going to probably more be within the bounds of not Russian collusion, but more financial. And so, there's this whole idea, which the New York Times has done a lot of really great reporting on, the amount of how money is passed through Trump Tower, for example. And there's been reporting that perhaps, and this, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there's been reporting that perhaps certain of the condominiums and apartments at Trump Tower were devalued for insurance purposes, but then sold at a higher rate, which is fraud, financial fraud, right? And so the irony being here that after all of this talk about, collusion and all the Russia, it might end up being more the Al Capone thing, where it's the taxes, right? It's the money. But it certainly looks like that. And so you have not only the DA, but also the state attorney general, who's been really, really focused on what's going on there as it relates to finances. And the thing I'll say is that, and just kind of in conclusion, I feel like I'm rambling, but as an FBI agent, I would much rather make a case on records, financial records, than I would on some intelligence or counterintelligence matter, because the numbers don't lie, right? The records are what they are. And so I say that to say that, even though the federal government has likely decided they're not going after Trump world, that doesn't mean that the local government, local prosecutors there won't have a very, very strong case, because even if it's nothing related to Russia, if it's other criminality, it's still criminality. And when you start getting into documents and money changing hands, that's sometimes a lot easier for investigators.
Okay, all right, thanks. So switching back, you may have touched on this momentarily. To what extent did the actions of agents like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page in sending anti-Trump emails undermine the view that the Russian investigation was nonpartisan?
It undermined it greatly. I mean, I still remember, and I write about this in Crossfire Hurricane, getting a note from one of our senior people at FBI headquarters saying, brace yourself, there's something coming out that is even worse than you can imagine. And I asked, well, what is it? And he said, well, imagine the worst thing that you can think happening right now, and then multiply that by a numerous factor beyond that. And finally, I told him, like, tell me what is happening. Like, what I'm thinking the worst. And he started to brief me on these messages between the two, and he was right. I mean, I could not have imagined a worse development while the FBI is in the throes of conducting this investigation, while the FBI is in the throes of receiving all of this criticism for Trump, calling the FBI crooks and criminals and out to get him, and Mueller's angry Democrats and all of that. And now it surfaces that, yeah, you have these two people who were instrumental in this investigation that were continually demonizing and saying all these bad things about Trump. So it was incredibly damaging, incredibly damning to this day. If you look, I watch Fox News sometimes and conservative media, and you continue to hear Strzok, Peter Strzok. It's like the gift that keeps on giving for them. And so I think it was and not just my view. I mean, that of my colleagues as well, that they let that organization down in a big way. So there's that. But then I have to note the second thing, and that is still, even though they may not like Donald Trump, this notion that these two individuals could have targeted Trump for prosecution because they disliked him is a house of cards. And I'll say that for two reasons. First, those who know the FBI know that no one does anything alone. Everyone, it's a team effort. So even if Peter Strzok or Lisa Page thought, you know what, we really hate Trump, we're going to take him down, they would have to convince the analysts, the FBI agents, the prosecutors, all of the people that actually do these investigations to go along with this, which is not going to happen because you're not going to get, that even if you have a handful of corrupt people, you're not going to get as many people as it takes to actually do that. The second thing is that the FBI has to show its work. So even if Strzok and Page thought, we're going to take down Donald Trump, we're going to manufacture evidence against him, you're going to have to show that in a court of law someday. And obviously we never got to that because there was not a prosecution of Donald Trump. But for me, that's what I want the public to know, that, even the worst fears that, they're targeting him for political prosecution, you still have to show your evidence and your work down the road. And then the final thing, which I think this is the most important point when it comes to this whole idea of the deep state, this whole idea of whether Donald Trump was a victim. Take yourself back to 2016 when you went to the polls to cast your vote. At the time, 4 members of the Trump team were under FBI investigation, counterintelligence investigation, for their associations with the Russians. Nobody knew it. The public didn't know it because the FBI had that investigation done secretly, as it does with its counterintelligence investigations. Now, there's been this controversy and criticism that how could the FBI announce the Clinton case publicly, but not announce the Trump case publicly. And that's totally fair criticism, by the way. But my point is that if the FBI, as Trump said, was out to get him and was trying to bring him down, if Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who were instrumental in this investigation, were out to get him, why didn't anyone know about it? The quickest way to bring down Donald Trump would be to have leaked that to the press before the election. That would have been the end of his campaign. To say that 4 people in your orbit are now in bed with the Russians, but no one did that. And so this whole deep state argument is such a house of cards. You just have to do a little bit of the critical thinking. So that's where I come down on this. I think that those text messages were incredibly damning. They were embarrassing, but I don't think I don't think you can draw a line from that to, aha, the FBI are crooks and they were out to get Trump.
Okay, all right, thanks. I think we've got a few questions left. I don't think I need any more. Where was I? So I have a question. What are American intelligence agencies prepared for cyber war that has come to our shores from all around us?
I think the answer is not fully prepared, as we just saw with the SolarWinds hack, for example, which the Biden administration has announced that they're going to start taking action against the Russians in some form. But I think it's the problem with the way that the FBI and intelligence agencies work, and I know this, having worked there, is that you get really good at preventing the last thing that happened. So, for example, after 9/11, obviously, the FBI or the American government, took all of these precautions and ramped up security and investigations and the like, because they didn't want the same thing that happened before to happen again. And you look at, for example, the 2016 election, where you had the Russians engaged in cyber warfare, undermining the Democratic Party, stealing emails, going after systems. The government got really good after that at trying to make sure that same thing didn't happen again. But in my view, personal view, there's not enough forward thinking about, well, what could the next one look like? And I don't think that's a big revelation, by the way, because we continue to see these new vectors, these new creative ways that adversaries are trying to go after, they're trying to use cyber warfare against the United States. And so I think the answer is no. I think it's yet to be seen kind of what the Biden team will do that's different from what we saw in Trump world. I mean, to their credit, the career people that were at, for example, DHS and the CISA, the cyber entity, did a really good job at trying to stop the Russians and others from actually impacting the 2020 election. There were attempts by the Russians to do it. But I don't know that even, and I know this having reported on these issues, that even the government doesn't have a a collective sense of that warm and fuzzy, that okay, we're good, we're as defended as we need to be, and that's a very real threat. And I think what we'll have to wait and see is how the Biden team responds to these cyber tactics, whether that's whether the responses are public or whether they're not. We know that governments around the world, will often respond in ways, using cyber tools that maybe they don't want to be public. And so we'll have to wait and see whether or not that's something that the Biden team does, and whether they see that as a natural deterrent. But the cyber angle is something that I worry about every single day, as a citizen and as a journalist, because we continue to see the threat out there, and we continue to see the results of that threat.
Okay, thanks. Go back to questions asked earlier, overlooked. McCabe's firing by Trump weeks before his pension was terrible. Can Biden reinstate McCabe long enough to get it?
Yes, he could. He could. The president could hire whomever he wants. I don't see that happening. I mean, I think from the Biden team's perspective, they just want to move on. And there was this issue with McCabe, right, about, well, did he lie to the inspector general whenever they were conducting an investigation? The IG, the inspector general, said that he did lie. And then, what seems so abusive in that situation is that just hours before he was able to retire, and get his FBI pension, the attorney general fires him. When they had all this time to do it in advance, or they could have done it afterwards after their own thorough investigation. So I think there's too much of a political angle there for the Biden team to even take this up. But to answer the question, yes, they could hire him back.
Okay, so I have two questions. I'm going to group them together. They're really about you. How and why did you join the FBI? Do you miss the work? And would you recommend it as a career? And would you ever go back to the FBI or another government position? And how does your FBI experience, security expertise, and education enhance your role as correspondent for CNN?
Wow, great questions. Thank you. So the beginning, how and why into the FBI, and I'll give you kind of the condensed version, because I write about this at length in the book, and that's not just so I hope you go buy the book, but I think I treat it longer and more detailed now, or in the book. But in summary, when I went into college, I thought I was going to be a diplomat. I wanted to go into the Foreign Service. And I was actually in college my freshman year for a full week whenever the attacks of 9/11 happened. And I remember watching that, as we all did. And that really changed the trajectory of what I wanted to do with my career, because I remember seeing how the FBI responded, and these, the law enforcement officers. And whereas I thought I wanted a career in diplomacy, I didn't feel very diplomatic after that, and not many of us did. And so what I thought, well, okay, how do I use my skills, my time, my effort into helping people? And I wanted to be like those law enforcement officers I saw on TV that were trying to investigate what happened while also trying to stop other threats and bring justice to the 3,000 victims. And so that was my trajectory into the FBI. I got an internship at the FBI and then was hired full-time afterwards. And so that was kind of my inroad. Would I recommend it? Absolutely. I still recommend. I still talk to people regularly, people who want to join the FBI of different ages, in different roles. They ask, well, what is it like? I still tell them that it is among the most honorable group of people that I've ever met. And it's one thing for me to say that. I describe in the book kind of how people, how they are in kind of a more thorough way. But it really is a special place. They're human, so they make mistakes, they screw up. And as a journalist, I cover their screw ups. But in the main, it is a truly honorable place. And so I certainly recommend it. As it relates to, do I miss it? Absolutely. I miss the work. One thing that's interesting, though, is that I think what I'm doing now is also a public service. And that is, helping the public understand fact from fiction, what's going on in the world, what are the threats that are out there. and I think that's important because obviously, there are threats that, I mean, I've lost count of the number of mass shootings that I've covered, but yet we still continue to try to dig into them and explain to people what's happening because it's important, and public safety is important. And so I continue in that vein. I'm still in the government technically. I'm still a reservist in the Navy. So I still have that sense of public service that continues as well. But as it relates to going back full time in some government role, I don't know is the answer. I mean, there's nothing like public service, in that regard. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I think right now this is. I feel like I'm doing a service in what we're doing now. And again, that's just helping keep the public informed, and especially in an era where there's so much misinformation and so much disinformation, to try to get up every single day and try to be part of, helping people understand not right from wrong, but fact from fiction, is something that I derive great joy from. So thanks for the question.
Sure. Okay. All right. I think we're at the conclusion. I want to remind the group that Josh's book, Crossfire Hurricane, is available. I believe we've arranged it through Anderson's Books. You can see information on the Temple website. You can contact Marty Cannon-Geyser directly if you have any questions. Certainly looks like a good read, and insight. So I want to thank you again, Josh, for joining us and sharing with us your experience and your insights. It was certainly very interesting. I think that's it, unless you have any last words.
No, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for spending the morning with me. This has been really great, and I hope to come back at some point as well. And there are obviously so many issues of consequence, that are happening that we see in the news on a daily basis. So if there's ever any topics, anything of interest to you, hit me up. I'd love to join you again.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Okay.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.